Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
Evelyn, thank you. Thanks for coming on to the podcast today.
I'm thrilled to be here. Spreading the
Yeah,
word.
just spreading the good word. Spreading the good word, and just give the listeners a brief overview as to who you are and what it is that you do now, just in case they've not come across the name.
Oh yeah, I don't want to assume anything. So I'm Evelyn Tribole. I'm co-founder of Intuitive Eating, a model that Elise Rush and I created over 30 years ago, believe it or not, that is now gaining in popularity both in social media, as in TikTok, but also the research is becoming quite extraordinary. Almost 200 studies now on the benefits of intuitive eating, which thrills me.
Yeah, that is, and that's something that I really love about it as well, because I've been someone who has, taken pride in being what I would call an evidence-based professional for so
Mhm.
long. And so then to read intuitive eating and particularly delve into the research, being lucky that it's been going for 30 years or so, to have that research is it's definitely been helpful in my persuasion to joining the movement, as it were. It makes it sound a bit
Well,
like a cult.
and it's interesting that you say that in terms of persuasion, because what I teach health professionals this model, and what I've come to
Mm,
see over the years, or shall I say decades, is cognitive dissonance is part of this path, both for health professionals using this model and for people who are in it. Because when we start
mm,
talking about rejecting the diet mentality,
mm.
that goes in the face of a lot of public health policy and so on. And they're like, what? And then we present all this research. They go, wow. And so now you're holding two things. And so it's challenging a belief system, and for some people a value system, which is why it takes a while to reconcile it. But once you get clear on that, ooh, it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful path. It's a pathway out of suffering, is the way I like to look at intuitive eating.
Yeah, I mean that's a great way to put it. And I like how you mentioned about the education of the healthcare profession, because it is very weight biased,
So much
and
so. Yeah.
that's how I was coached, and it was the younger version of myself who was who felt like he shouldn't be in a larger body, who felt
Mm,
a bit of negative stigma because of that in the health industry. Everything was saying about being this kind of lean, fit, aesthetic shape, and then going into nutrition education, it's very much a case of here's how you help people lose weight. It was
mm.
like, okay, yeah, this is a healthy diet, but here's how you help people lose weight. So it's so interesting then to just change the narrative of say,
It's
well,
a
actually,
it's
why
a
don't we just focus on
completely
improving people's health?
Yeah, it's a complete change in the narrative. And I often will say when I'm introducing myself in my trainings that I have a master's degree in diet culture and a bachelor of science in diet culture, because there's some similarities of what you just described. Now, the good news is there was some benefit from those degrees in terms of being able to really deconstruct and look at research and ask, the important
Mm-hmm.
questions. And then once you see it, you really can't unsee it. It's like the Matrix, when you take the red pill. Once you see it, it's like, holy moly.
Yeah, it's a really good analogy of that, actually, because
Yeah.
it's so true. The more once you kind of see it and uncover things, and then the more you read into it, and you look at even just the history of the BMI, and then you look at actually the research around all cause mortality and BMI associations, and how it's not where they would want it to sit for using BMI as a place to not to mention that on the individual level, it shows us absolutely nothing about an individual's health.
Well, and actually, since you mentioned all-cause mortality, I'm going to take that opportunity to mention that when you start looking at
Go
the
on.
research now on weight cycling, that increases
Mm,
all-cause mortality. Weight cycling increases risk of cardiovascular disease. Weight cycling increases high blood pressure. Weight cycling increases osteoporosis or osteopenia in men. And I'd imagine you see the same thing on women if they took a look at that. And so that's
mm,
what really gets me. It'd be one thing if dieting and the pursuit of weight loss was just some little hobby that didn't work, but this is something that only doesn't work, it actually hurts you, and that's what
mm-hmm,
really gets me. So it increases weight stigma, increases risk of eating disorders, increases anti-fat bias, and all these types of things, and ultimately it erodes your trust with yourself and your body. It's a huge trust disruptor when you are outsourcing your eating to some influencer, some guru, some meal plan at the expense of not getting to know you. And it's why I
mm-hmm.
work with so many individuals who are often in tears and saying, I can count the macros in a single grain of rice, but I don't know how to fucking eat. I'm just repeating what my patients say. And there's
Yeah.
truth. And so then I will ask, how often were you taught or encouraged to connect to your body? Usually the
Mm,
answer is never. And then I say, well, it's
hmm.
understandable. Then you have this perception that you don't know how to eat because diets don't really, connect you with those aspects. The to aiming for satisfaction in your eating and so forth, and all the 10
No.
principles of intuitive eating. Yeah,
Well, yeah, and I'm really glad you brought that up because you and I kind of just have gone full blown into this podcast with obviously our like
I know.
fervor and
Huh?
excitement, and we forgot actually to really define what intuitive eating is. And I'd love that if you could just give us a, let's say this is the first time someone's come across it. How would you define intuitive eating?
It's so interesting. I define it different ways to different people, and they all have validity. And so I'll just start really
Sure.
broad. One way we can say it, it's an evidence-based self-care framework that's rooted in compassionate dignity and respect for all bodies, and I mean all
Hmm.
bodies. Then we can get a little bit
Mm,
deeper and say it includes, 10. The framework has 10 principles, and then we get a little deeper and say, and the mechanism is interoceptive awareness, which is our ability to
hmm.
perceive physical sensations that arise within the body. And that sounds obvious, like, when you have a full bladder, what that feels like, you got to pee, thank God, right?
Hmm.
Some people are connected to hunger and fullness, biological cues, and interoceptive awareness also includes emotions. Every emotion has a physical sensation, and so when you're connected to that, you're really connected to the needs of your body, both biologically and psychologically, and that's what really gets disrupted with all of these dieting, by whatever name you go, whatever by whatever name it goes by. Lifestyle change. It's not a diet, it's a lifestyle change, and it's just shape shifting, diet culture slash wellness culture. So, yeah,
Mm. Yeah, and I love that definition. It's a definition that I commonly like to use is that combination of intuition, internal signaling, emotion, and rational thought, because
absolutely.
it's that combination of those three things rather than just one of them by themselves, and that interplay together actually creates a powerful framework to help you decide, as you said, how to fucking eat.
Absolutely. And then actually that's one of Elisa's favorite definitions is the interplay of all those three things. And you also
Mm,
cannot take one principle, you can't cherry pick a principle of intuitive eating and say that's what intuitive eating is. It's not the hunger fullness diet. These aren't rules,
no.
they're guidelines to help you self-connect. And there's no pass or fail. Even if you eat in a way that is uncomfortable or even disappointing to yourself, that's a learning experience if you're willing to take a look at that. And so
Hmm.
it's a beautiful pathway that we get a lot of unsolicited email and DMs and letters, even sometimes, of people saying, my life has really changed, through intuitive eating. And I think in part, when you start to reconnect with your body, your sense of self gets stronger, your sense of self-trust gets stronger, and then that bleeds into other areas of your life in a really, really positive way.
Yeah, yeah, massively, and it's so great to see how that's developing over time, and as you said, the research of like weight cycling and going on and off diets, and how that has a much bigger negative effect of all cause mortality, and how you've then brought in this principle of eating that brings you back to trusting your body, and therefore rebuilding that trust, making peace with food, following those 10 pillars of intuitive eating
Yeah.
can actually help improve people's health outcomes for the better.
And that's what surprises people. So it's so interesting if people are new to intuitive eating, and if they've only seen it through social media.
Hmm.
There's some positive things of social media in the there's a lot of misunderstanding. They see post all of this big feast, candy and colorful donuts and cupcakes and whatnot. And we can certainly say that's a part of intuitive eating, the make peace with
Hmm.
food, but there's so much
Hmm.
more to that, because there's a really interesting phenomenon which I call the permission paradox, and that is when you have
Hmm.
permission to eat food, or a kind of food or a meal, maybe for the first time you really get to ask yourself, do I really want this? Do I want it
Hmm.
now? Because I can have it whenever I want to. And it changes the whole relationship and the whole dynamic. And what's kind of interesting, or at least to me, is when we developed intuitive eating, we can say that it was research inspired. We went to a lot of research that informed our work, but now to fast forward and have so many studies on our work saying, hey, you know what? There's a lot of psychological health benefits, there are
Hmm.
physical health benefits, and so forth. And so the point I was going to make that I forgot to is
No,
that
go on.
people who don't know the model and they get into fear
Yeah.
mongering. Oh, if you let people eat whatever they want to, it's going to be a big old mess on your health. And actually, a new
Mm,
study just came out looking at 14 intervention studies in which they used intuitive eating, and they asked the question, and what was the impact on the quality of the eating in terms of the overall diet and nutrition? And what they found is
yeah.
intuitive eating was either neutral or it improved it. And so it
Right.
goes against what the naysayers are saying. Oh my God, I would never stop eating cake. And I've had people say that to me. Oh my God, I would never stop eating chocolate. You name the food. And what I would say
Hmm.
to the individual, if that's your belief and fear of looking into this, is I find it usually reflects the amount of deprivation you've had. So if you haven't had
Yes.
chocolate in a really long time and you finally get to have it, and you don't think you're going to have it again because it's a safe farewell to food feast, because next week you're starting the new greatest lifestyle, who knows, whatever it happens to be, it
Mm,
creates that scarcity mindset, and there becomes an urgency to eat it now while you can and get more of it, because you're never ever going to have it again. It's a
hmm.
profound phenomenon. Yeah.
Yeah, it is, massively, and I'm really glad you brought that up, Evelyn, because you're right in that the social media. I mean, you said there's good and bad to it, and I agree. I think there's sometimes more bad than good in terms of how polarizing people can be, or how
Yeah.
they literally take the small thing that you said and avoid all nuance to it. Um, but the intuitive eating, even one of the pillars in it is gentle nutrition,
Yes. Yeah.
but people
Yeah.
focus on make peace with food, and that's what's portrayed so often. Because you're right in that you've got this research now to say, hey, when we give people these frameworks to work on as a combination, their quality of diet improved, because there's no longer that deprivation, there's no longer that restriction. Because when people say, oh, I'll never stop eating chocolate, I'll never stop eating cake, they do truly believe that, because
Yes.
every time
Really in
they
the
eat
moment.
that, it's their diet voices, and it's their inner diet voices saying that they shouldn't be eating that. So therefore, it's the last time they're going to eat that food. So they might as well enjoy it, because then from the next day, they're going to be eating healthy. But their definition of eating healthy is restriction because of diet culture.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so there's also this fear that, if you seek satisfaction in eating, or dare we say pleasure, oh my gosh,
Mm.
you're going to lose control, when it's actually just the opposite, because you end up satisfied. It's like, why would you want to eat to a point that you're physically uncomfortable if you're satisfied? And I was really lucky early in my career. I was on a task force with Julia Child, and it was at a time. Well, it was polarizing back then between the chefs and the nutritionists. And she's like, "Can we all get along?" And so we'd get together, chefs and nutritionists, once a month. And this was so long ago that Julia Child would speak on a speakerphone. There was no video conferencing, and we hear her voice. I felt like one of Charlie's angels. I never met her in person, but we certainly heard from her. And at the end of all of this discussion, what we came up with is, to the chefs of the world, when you're designing these amazing meals, please consider health. And to the nutritionists of the world, for the love of God, would you please consider taste? There's some place in between. And we never
Mm.
know, by looking at one person's meal or day or week, what is going on, with them. You might have just come back from a big old long, actually, you know what, when I this just happened to me the other day. I went surfing, and I was in the water for a really long time, and I came home and I was so hungry, and I put my head into this giant burrito. And then I came up for air. Because I was so intensely hungry, it was urgent. If a stranger came by, they'd be, "My God, what is with this woman? I look like a little, puppy's head in a bowl." But that's just where my body was, and I felt very content afterwards. So yeah, no judgment, no guilt. I thought it was funny, actually.
Well, yeah, and it is, and I think you had a great. There's a great lesson there, Evelyn, is that you said you can't get the whole picture of a person from a single meal in a single situation, and I think that's something that really it's something that I've noticed more and more that's really disgusting me, is that, so like I've got clients who are in larger bodies, for example, and when they're talking to me about improving their health and their eating habits, with we're using the frameworks of intuitive eating and we're making peace with food, but they experience negative stigma if they're in the queue for a fast food joint.
Mm.
and you just think, and I would not receive that same stigma as someone who is more
That
straight
is such
size.
a good point. That is because that's a really good point of a social justice issue. Take somebody who has thin privilege, they go into a donut shop and they post it on TikTok or Instagram and they're celebrating. Oh my God, that's so awesome. You take somebody in a larger body, a marginalized body, and now they're getting death threats and all kinds of things. I
Yeah, don't you
follow,
care about your health? Like, what are you
yeah,
doing?
yeah,
Glorifying
as if
eating
you
junk
know
food.
health. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
it's
and not
awful.
recognizing that bullying and trolling and weight stigma has a huge impact on, our mental health, which is health as well. And that's why we need to get policy change. All these things that are going on, attacking people in larger bodies is really, it's awful.
It is awful, and I guess that, I mean, something I wanted to kind of get your take on was why you wanted to create intuitive eating in the first place. Like,
Yeah.
what's the story there?
Well, I'm so glad you're asking that. So the story is this, is that Elise and I were both in private practice, but separately. We were I actually rented an office from her, and every once in a while we'd run into each other in the hallway. That's just a little side note. And we were just seeing
Mm,
so much suffering in the lives of our patients who would be dieting, and we would do these like dietitian food plans, swapping out foods, and they would feel okay for a little bit, and then they come back in and thinking that there's something wrong with them.
yeah,
And it's
yeah,
like, no, there is nothing wrong with you. There's something wrong with food restriction. There's something wrong with the way that Elise and I were traditionally trained rather. And that's when we thought, you know what, there's got to be another way. So we did a deep dive into the research. We also considered what was happening in mainstream media. Like, there was a book out called Overcoming Overeating by Hirschman and
mm,
Hunter that had a big impact on us. But I'll give you some examples of some key studies. I think it's important, and we don't talk about it in the book because we originally wrote it for consumers. But the
mm.
Minnesota starvation study, I don't know if you're familiar with
Oh
that,
yeah,
but
oh
I
yeah, and
remember it's two huge volumes, like a couple thousand pages. But for those who are not familiar,
mm,
they took um, um, men who were, oh my God, I'm forgetting what the term is, who didn't want to fight in the war due to their.
conscientious objectors.
Thank you. And this was during World War II, and they looked at the men and evaluated them both medically and psychologically, and they were like super duper healthy. They were like amazing men, and then they put them on a semi-starvation diet and observed the
Mm,
effects, and it blew my mind. Not what happened
mm,
to them biologically, that was interesting, but these men couldn't stop talking about. We're going on and on, and recipes and cooks. And this back time when there were no TV food shows and chefs running around and doing all their amazing celebrity things that they do to entertain us. In fact, one man, and I'm going to quote it from the actual study, said that he couldn't stand the nutrition masturbation because of all this self-talk about the eating. I thought, oh my God, this sounds like my patients. They get so self-absorbed into the
yeah,
minutia, and that's what happens to the mind when you're not getting enough to eat. The mind is focused on food because it's like, hey, we need you to survive. Hey, dude, think about this chocolate. Think about all these things. And what ended up happening when men finally had access to food, they had a hard time stopping eating. And in fact, during the
mm,
the restriction part of the study, some of the men couldn't stand the rules of the diet and developed eating disorder behaviors. Like, one man went out and stole candy, and he felt so guilty he threw up. Threw it out. That's purging. That's bulimia. Another man did something similar
yeah,
with milkshakes. And what's so shocking is when you take a look at what they were actually eating, they were actually eating. It was like a modern day food restriction. So you take healthy men and
yes,
you create this problem. And then fast
mm,
forward, there's been a body of research that shows that dieting doesn't work and creates all these other kinds of problems. So that was a huge influence. Another influence was an area called restraint theory, and it got very scientific and very into all the details. But when the researchers were talking about, it's really the what the hell effect, I go, oh my God,
yeah,
they got my attention. And they were describing the phenomenon of when people have rigid rules around eating to suppress their weight or to lose weight, and then something comes along to break that restraint, and then it's all hell breaks loose. It's all
yeah,
or none kind of eating. And I would say part of what breaks restraint also is hunger. There's nothing wrong with you. So that had a huge impact. And then the work of L.L. Birch, who's or was rather a prolific researcher in the parent-child feeding relationship. And what they found is that well-meaning parents, and I don't want to throw parents under the bus. Parenting is one of the most humbling things you can do. But well-meaning
mm,
parents who had rigid rules around their kids eating end up creating the opposite effect that they desired. So the kids that weren't
Yeah.
allowed sugar, those are the kids that went to the birthday parties and went, bananas, piling it in
Hmm.
to whatever degree they can. And so her research showed that you end up focusing on the very food that you're not allowed to have, and you end up getting dysregulated. So those three key areas, or was it four, really helped to inform our work. Plus the the experiences we had working with our own patients in eating disorder work. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing those up, Evelyn, because it's interesting how what you were experiencing with your patients are things that I was experiencing with myself and I was
Mm.
experiencing with my clients.
Ah.
And so people who are listening to this podcast know my background, but as someone who had lost weight successfully through tracking his calories
Mm.
excessively, and that was like after quite a few different diets of different means, I became a nutrition coach and thought, well, this is the holy grail. This is how I'm going to help my clients myself. But every time I stopped tracking, I wasn't maintaining my weight loss. I was overeating, but I was kind of returning to normal habits and behaviors. Similar things were happening with my clients, and it was, the combination of the deprivation effect, the what the hell effect, things
Yeah.
like that you see in the Minnesota starvation study. And I'm really glad you brought in the starvation study because, so as someone who was trained as a weight loss practitioner, just call it for what it is. The starvation experiment is actually used in some evidence-based models to showcase why um, the starvation mode doesn't exist. But
Doesn't
actually, I don't
exist.
think that's what. Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
So because they say that if you see these men, look at how they still continue to lose weight despite being starving, and I'm like, yeah, but that's not what that study shows us. It shows us, yes,
No.
that their weight went down, but actually, if we look at the rate of their weight loss, it drops drastically, and so does all of their movement, and the psychological effects were far more concerning because then wasn't there a massive rebound in all of their weights as well as
There
then
was,
their
and I
psychological effects of all of them lasting for years after the study.
years, and in fact, I think we have to. I'm going to use my own term here. What we have to also consider with the snapshot here. These were
Yeah.
dieting virgins. People had never been on food restriction, and so people have
No.
never been on food restriction. The body, doesn't know. Well, it gets wise once the restriction
Mm,
starts. That every time you start another kind of diet, it's going to do something to protect itself. And so here's what's really fascinating when you look at the research. It takes 2 to 5 years, more like 5 years, before you see the rebound weight gain. In fact, the work of Tracy Mann out at UCLA showed that, reviewing 30 studies, that for the vast majority of people, they will gain back more weight than what they've lost. And this is a survival mechanism. And it's really interesting if you want to get into the weeds. If you start looking at famine research, like the Dutch famine, in which where they tracked how much they were eating because they were on food rations, and they also documented the outcomes. And the moms that gave birth
mm,
to babies during the famine became adults who had issues with diabetes. They had larger bodies, not because that's a problem, but because that's a survival mechanism.
yes.
And so
Yeah.
every
Yeah.
time you diet, it's ratcheting that up. And yet I want to be careful when I say this, that I don't want to give the impression that being in a larger weight body is a problem or a bad thing, the way that
No. No.
healthcare policy asserts itself, in spite of the body of research that shows otherwise. In fact, there was a big study out of the UK on almost, oh my God, I think it was 20,000 teenagers followed over a 30-year span. And what they found is dieting didn't work. And they saw that there was an increased risk of depression that correlated with the dieting. It's like, how much research do we need in order to show this? And part of my frustration is like, well, how come you can look at this research and not change your opinion? And then I came across the Semmelweis reflex, which is
Mm,
named after the doctor who discovered that hand washing can save lives back in a time when doctors didn't wash their hands. And he did a small study in which they washed their hands and lives were saved, presented it to these physicians, and they were like, they scoffed at him like, we're gentlemen, we don't need to wash our hands. And this is before germ theory came out. And so fast forward, the Semmelweis reflex is named after Dr. Semmelweis to recognize that when new data come out that challenge the popular paradigm, it is met
mm,
with incredulity. And the last time we
mm,
really saw that was with gastric ulcers. for a long, long time, doctors thought that gastric ulcers are a result of your lifestyle. And two physicians did some research and found no, it's actually a bacteria that causes it. They'd publish it, and the medical elite disregarded it. And one of the physicians got so frustrated, he isolated that bacteria, gave it to himself, and created the gastric ulcer. And fast forward, and I forget what year it was, that they ended up getting the Nobel Prize in medicine. That's an example of the Semmelweis reflex. What makes it so difficult when it comes to weight is how long body hierarchying has been around as a way to keep people in their place. And that's strange wording, but the works I'd recommend is by Sabrina Strings, who wrote the book, Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia, really tracing that, and that this kind of body hierarchying and prejudice existed before even healthcare came onto the scene. So there's a lot here. Yeah.
Oh yeah, massively, massively, and I'm really glad that you brought up those that bit of research with the 20,000 teenagers and showing just that effect. And I'm glad you said obviously there's nothing wrong with people being in large bodies, but you said how there is that weight cycling from the repetitive attempts of dieting and the body's the body's act of maintaining its balance and protecting against that weight loss. And that's known as set point theory, right? The body has a set point it wants to maintain. If you dip below that, it's going to go through pretty drastic means to bring it back to that, but often overshoots it in preparation or at least defense of the next perceived famine.
Well, what's interesting with set point theory, I used to talk about it a lot with my patients, and what I found is it kept the focus on weight,
Yeah.
And part of this journey about letting go of the attachment to weight, letting go of the attachment to weight loss. I think what set point theory helps us do is to understand that our weight, for the most part, is really beyond our conscious control. There are so many mechanisms that get ignited and triggered when there is restriction that happens. In fact, isn't it interesting? Some new research just came out showing that intermittent fasting can trigger binge eating. It's not a surprise to the people in the eating disorders world. And the thing that's so confusing, I think, for a lot of people, you see all these headline news, oh, intermittent fasting is the latest, greatest. And in order, when we're looking at weight-based studies, and sometimes intermittent fasting is not, they're not looking at weight per se, they're looking at other kinds of health issues, but a lot of it is weight. We need to be looking at a 5-year mark. How long was this study done? How long were these people followed for? And did they measure for unintended consequences? The vast majority of these weight kinds of studies do not measure for unintended consequences. And when you start looking at unintended consequences, it is fascinating what you start seeing. We've seen in kids, I think it was a study on over 17,000 kids that were dieting were 8-fold as more likely to engage in binge eating. And we've seen that in a lot of different studies on adults. We've seen it in war studies, and now we're seeing it in intermittent fasting. And people who have food insecurity, meaning they don't have consistent access to food, they will often engage in binge eating or loss of control eating as a compensatory effect for what is happening. This has not been taken seriously enough in the research world, that this thing that you are recommending is causing a lot of problems and a lot of harm. And what ends up happening, someone thinks, oh my God, here I go again. I'm out of control. My body's out of control. I need something to control it. When actually, no, your body's actually really working. Your body is trying to get you to eat. That's why you're thinking of amazing foods. You're thinking of the carbs and the pasta. You're not craving kale. I've never had a person come in saying, you know what, I got this kale problem. It's because of survival. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I like how you brought up that longitudinal research part of it, of like looking at 5 years or more, because you're right in that the weight centric research for diet interventions that are successful are short term. I remember again being a more weight centric practitioner, this idea of intermittent fasting, but also intermittent dieting being like a major player, but the research studies were like 6 weeks long.
Yeah.
And they were like, look at what happened within 6 weeks, and you're like, yeah, but what happens in 6 years?
Exactly. Let's see. In fact, it's a really good example. If you take a look at the Biggest Loser study, it was a small study
Yes.
because there's not that many people. But when you look at, they took people who were on that show and they looked at their baseline levels, and then 6 years later. And 6 years later, they actually had less muscle mass than which they started the show. 6 years
Right.
later, their metabolic rate was down by 700 calories a day. And 6 years later, a lot of them were trending toward, insulin. I'm sorry, they were trending towards pre-diabetes. And so this is
Right.
not innocuous. These things live on, but people don't talk about it because they think there's something wrong with them. It's like, no, nothing wrong with you. Something wrong with the system.
No.
Hmm.
Yeah, and you're right. Then it's like if you talk about things like set point, it brings the focus onto weight rather than onto health and
Yeah.
relationship with food and all of these other much more important outcomes. I think that is a question that I get thrown a lot, is that there's a lot of chat about the 21st century that we are in, and the fact that again, I'm bringing up weight, but it's purely because of the question that you get. The average weight of both the US and the UK has gone up,
Hmm.
and this modern food environment that we live in, where we have more heavily processed food. When we're working with intuitive eating and we're saying, hey, we want to make peace with food, no foods in and of themselves can cause negative health effects. People are like, yes, but is intuitive eating possible in our modern food environment where we have such new foods compared to your, nutrient dense, fewer processed foods?
Yeah, it's a good question. I get that one asked a lot. And what's really interesting, and now the hot buzzword is ultra processed foods, not just processed.
Yes, from the
And
NOVA
there's not even
guidelines, right?
yes, and there's not even an agreement as to what defines an ultra processed food.
No.
And when you start looking at what makes up ultra processed foods, it might be surprising to know 40 to 60% are vegan or vegetarian foods. And would you consider
Yeah,
those,
right.
quote, unhealthy? And so it's an example of more fear mongering. It's like, oh, we're living in
Mm-hmm.
a way that this can't happen. Oh, the food companies are putting things in to make you not, stop eating. And so one way I
Mm-hmm.
look at that, I was like, if you're having a dinner for dear friends, you're probably going to want to make something that tastes really good, and you're going to put some effort
Mm-hmm.
into that. I don't think that's a crime. And the food companies do the same. And I'm not here to be a mouthpiece for the food companies. And yeah, there's some stuff that could be turned around in terms of some of their marketing practices and so on. But it's not a reason
Mm-hmm.
why we can't connect to our own bodies. So what I find when I get that kind of criticism, I like to find out about the individual who's asking the question. Well, tell me about your
Mm-hmm.
background, with your relationship with food. Do you have any
Mm-hmm.
rules around eating? Have you been on any diets? And often, again, the fear mongering is happening from people who have felt like they don't have control around their eating. I've had a lot of people I've worked with who thought that they were addicted to food or addicted to
Yes.
sugar. And when you start looking at the research doesn't really bear that out. The one animal study that's
No.
fascinating is when they took rats, they put two groups of rats. One group got restricted access to food, the other group did not, and then they all got access to sugar. The rats that
Mm.
had food restriction couldn't stop eating sugar. And to me, the message
No.
isn't about food addiction. Like, oh, look what's happening when you don't get enough to eat. You're going to go for all the foods and all the things. That's the fascinating part, to me on that. And so, yeah, the fear mongering is problematic. Again, if we look at intuitive eating, that study I mentioned in the very beginning, 14 intervention studies showing that actually the quality of the eating improved. There's also been
Yes.
some studies looking at blood sugar regulation that improves with intuitive eating. Also looking
Mm-hmm.
at blood lipids, cholesterol and triglyceride levels also
Mm.
improving. So the direction's actually really pretty nice. So the fear mongering that is talked about is actually not borne out by the research, number one. And number two, in the people that we work with, we don't see this happening like this. But let's take an ultra processed food, I don't know, potato chips or something. And if
Hmm.
that has always been on your list of forbidden foods, like I can't have these, don't eat these, then
Mm.
yeah, when you finally have a bag, you're probably going to want to inhale them because they're forbidden and you don't think you're going to ever
Mm.
have them again, or it's your quote, your cheat day, you know? And so that all that does is increases the scarcity mentality in which you've got to have more of it and you're more obsessed. It's kind of like, when COVID happened, I don't know if it happened in the UK, but in the United States, there was a toilet paper shortages. You couldn't buy toilet
Yeah.
paper. People were hoarding it. They were talking about it. Oh my gosh, get toilet. It's the same thing when someone's on a diet. You're depriving yourself of food, and now you're talking about the food, and so and it's scarcity mindset. We got to see what that looks like, and
Oh
experience.
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought up the toilet paper actually, because everybody listening to this will remember that, and that's a really good angle and
Yeah.
metaphor to help
Well,
people
and you know what?
appreciate that.
The other thing I want to mention is that making peace with food can also include there's nuances. It also means you can have salad or vegetables. You don't have to explain to anybody. It doesn't mean you are in diet culture. And what I find on social media, people aren't posting about those things. So it's not so exciting. But so there's a true freedom that happens. It's peace with eating and peace with your body. And who doesn't want that?
Oh yeah, massively. And I think the fitness industry is a big
Mm,
it's a hot mess
yeah, I would agree
to
with
put it
that. Yeah.
to put it lightly. And being someone who is heavily inside of it in my past self, I couldn't quite see the hypocrisy of what I was spouting
Mm.
until I was on the other side of it.
Oh,
The
makes
Matrix,
sense.
the pill.
Yeah.
So I was someone who was I was an on the floor coach, so I was coaching for 5 6 hours a day. I also exercised incredibly excessively because I was wanting to perform in a certain sport,
Mm.
and that was the kind of level of training you needed to do. So, but then I also lived in London, so I had to walk to the tube station, stand up on the tube, walk to the gym, and do the same thing back. And I'm there like, hey, don't worry, guys, you should just track your calories and you'll be able to get lean just like I am. And
Mm.
even though calorie tracking is a type of external restriction, the calories I was on was a large amount of calories, 3,500 calories a day, and I'm there eating cereal and eating burgers and as well as all of the nutrient dense foods as well, and then being like, yeah, guys, don't worry, it's easy. You can just do it like I do it. And I think that's the issue, isn't it? Is that people see these people who are incredibly active, and they don't see themselves the privilege they have of the lifestyle they lead, the activity they have, and the genetics, as well as then all of that
Yeah.
opportunity to do that. To then say, guys, it's easy. You just need to do these things.
Yeah, it's making that assumption that if you eat just like I do, you're gonna have the body that I do, you know?
Yes,
And that's
eat like I do,
incredibly.
exercise like I do, and you'll look like
Yeah,
me.
it ignores genetics on so many levels, and it's making all these assumptions that are so problematic. And so it's awesome that you've been on the other side, and now you're coming out and saying, "Hey, this is a problem." And P.S. By the way, there's been research on food tracking apps like MyFitnessPal really
Mhm.
correlating with eating disorders in a very strong way. And so that tracking also is not innocuous.
No, no, exactly, and
Yeah.
that's something that I discovered going through it. At first it was that honeymoon period, as you mentioned, of people who are inexperienced dieters when they have that first effort.
Yeah.
It's all
It's
hunky
like a first
dory, but
love.
then
It's
it's
effortless, it's easy. What are you guys all complaining about? And then
yeah,
something
yeah,
happens, and then diet after
and
diet gets harder and harder, not because you
yes,
don't do it correctly, it's your body is trying to survive.
and I think that's also something that I'm really despising in the fitness industry is that 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 rhetoric of people in larger bodies not wanting it enough, not trying hard enough, not having that motivation, where actually they probably try harder than anyone.
Oh, it's making all the assumptions. I'm thinking of right now of Latoya Shante, who's a runner, a marathoner, and does other kinds of sports as well. And this was actually
Mm,
before COVID. She got fat shamed running a marathon at the 21-mile mark. It's like, oh my God, this woman is already at the 21-mile mark, and you're making assumptions about her abilities based on the size of her body. And so I
mm,
guess one way we can look at this for those who want to pursue health, of course you can, but weight
mm,
is not a behavior. We can look at
no,
healthy behaviors like, getting adequate sleep, adequate hydration, having relationships. One of the things that's really interesting research wise, that seems to be one of the strongest aspects in terms of health, is having being engaged in meaningful relationships. And the interesting thing is
Yes.
when you are constantly on some kind of diet or food plan, it really creates a separation or a wedge in the
Mm,
relationship. Like you might be there at the dinner with friends, but your mind's not there. You're worrying or calculating how you're going to make up for what you ate, or worrying about what you are eating, or how can I restrict in a way that doesn't show it, and you're
mm.
not there. And that's the other feedback I get from a lot of partners of people who've been on these kind of plans. Like, thank you, I have my partner back now, because they're not preoccupied with all of the rules and the tracking and the counting and all these things.
Yeah, and I have clients say that to me about their own mental headspace as well. Is that my voice, my brain just feels clearer now. There's not
Yeah.
that incessant, constant noise about because they were constantly fighting with the diet voices that were in their heads.
Right, and which is a survival mechanism. So what's really interesting is about a year and a half ago, a meta-analysis study came out on intuitive eating. They reviewed over 90 studies looking at the psychological correlates of intuitive eating, and
Mm,
it came out so well. Intuitive eaters have better well-being. They're more connected to their bodies. They have less, anxiety, less depressive symptoms, less eating disorder behaviors, and so on and so on. It's just
mm.
really incredible. And so that's what we need to be looking at, is overall health, not just one aspect of what someone perceives as healthy.
Yes, absolutely. Because as we've mentioned, in terms of like weight and all-cause mortality and BMI and things, it's a lie that's been fed to us by that industry.
Yeah.
A question I have: so if you're someone who has, your body, your mind, you've done years of dieting, messed up, how do you how do you begin to learn to trust yourself to intuitively eat?
Ah,
Like what's that first stage? Because there are the 10 frameworks.
yeah.
Do you go from 1 to 10? How do you begin that process? It must feel
Good
scary.
question. You know what? And I think we need to acknowledge that it can really be scary when you're used to having all these rules, and suddenly, and suddenly now there's all this freedom. It's like giving a
Mm,
writer a blank sheet of paper or a blank screen on the computer and saying, "Here, write the best novel. You can use all the words in any order that you want to." That's a daunting idea. So let me say this. Number one, it is possible. I have worked with people who have been dieting like all their life, and these are like 70-year-old individuals. And trust can be cultivated just like how it was broken. So every time you are
hmm
hungry and you honor that hunger with each bite of food, you are cultivating trust. I will often like to begin, and so does Elise, with the principle of, aim for satisfaction in your
Right.
eating, because it's very personal. I can't tell you what's satisfying, what tastes good, what sounds good, but because
Mm,
it is so personal, you get to ask, what might be a satisfying meal? What's my favorite? I've had people who don't know. I've had people break down and crying. I don't even know what I like to eat anymore because I've been following so many diets. Ultimately, it's not satisfying to undereat, and ultimately, it's not satisfying to eat in a way in which you're feeling uncomfortably full. And so when you're aiming for satisfaction, it's a way of getting into balance without the rules. You're getting to know your body all over again, and it's possible. That's the part. And what I would say, if there's anyone out there really struggling, like maybe you're saying I've tried it, a couple of things. You might need to work with a health professional that's been trained and certified intuitive eating. You might want to think about the workbook. That might be another way of doing that. So, and if
mm,
somebody has like an eating disorder, it's going to take a team, to work with somebody. And what's so scary right now is how eating disorders have escalated. They have doubled in the 2000s. I mean, it's now like at nearly 8%, where before it was, less than 4%. And it takes a village to help with the treatment. But when we have a culture that is engaged in eating disorder behavior, like
mm.
fasting and all these kinds of things, a lot of people go they don't even realize they have an eating disorder sometimes until they're in it really deep. And the other message then is that eating disorders are treatable. There is a way out. Suffering doesn't have to be like that. um,
Hmm.
yeah.
No, well, yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's great to point people towards the director of intuitive eating counselors, and also like, workbook. The workbook's great,
Thank you.
to the combination of reading the book and then the workbook. And that prevalence of eating disorders and how that's going up is just,
Yeah.
and it's just such a shame, isn't it? And I think that there's a combination of, I think, social media and then being to blame, because it's like, in the past we would have had just mainstream media, TV, magazines, and that would be your daily dose of diet culture.
Hmm.
Whereas now social media connects you to millions of people who
Yeah.
would portray you these things, and the algorithm will show you more of what you interact with, right? So let's say you're down a TikTok rabbit hole of people in certain body shapes going through certain behaviors. That's all you're going to see.
Yeah, and you know what's kind of scary, and I've seen this happen, where people are doing like what I eat in a day, or they're showing all their meal prep stuff, and then 2 or 3 years later, it's like, oops, I had an eating disorder and I didn't know it, and I realize that these influencers are not intentionally causing harm, but they actually
No.
are, and here they thought they're being, virtuous with all their food rules and what they don't eat, and that's
Mm-hmm.
that's a real problem too, a real problem.
It is, yeah, and you're right. Even though they can, uh, it's like a hindsight's a wonderful thing, right? They can
Yeah,
kind of see that later on,
yeah.
in the
Well,
moment they're doing more damage than they might think unintentionally.
so what was your turning point for you that let you out of diet culture? That is like this isn't working, or what was there like a diet bottom that you hit, or was it just a realization from seeing intuitive eating, or what was the story for you?
Yeah, it wasn't a diet bottom, but it was like a slow death. I think, and I wanted to find diet culture with you as well, because
Yeah.
I definitely have been exploring very much like the messy middle between like what's diet culture and what can we do for like promoting healthy behaviors. Because I
Hmm.
think that there are always extremists in every camp, right? And I think there are some anti-diet campists who are very much like anti-exercise and anti like, and they might be quite new in their journey. But when people are like anti, let's say, evidence-based nutrition recommendations for strength training, but if someone's an intuitive eater and they want to strength train, then they can follow recommendations without it becoming diet culture. So there's a conversation there. But for me, it was that combination of the fact that okay, I had I've weight cycled myself up and down, up and down, up and down, and when I became a nutritionist, it was because I was in the middle of like my honeymoon period of tracking macros. So I'd gotten really lean, and I was tracking my calories and macros, and I got certified as a nutritionist, and read everything I could about flexible dieting and if it fits your macros and all the rest of it. And I was like, right, this is my calling. Like, I need to help people lose weight because I've done it. I was a slightly bigger lad. I was like, it's possible. You just need to do this. And then what I found when I was in that macro tracking phase was that anytime I didn't track or I went over, it was the what the hell effect. I
Ah,
was
ah.
I was overeating like crazy, so much so that I was physically sick on a number of occasions
Mm,
because
mm.
of eating to that much excess, just
Sure.
out of control.
Which was triggered by the
Despite
restriction, you know?
despite being on a higher calorie amount, even though I was on those higher calories and was eating flexibly, it's funny how
Wasn't enough. Yeah.
I still had that restricted mentality, right? So I went through a couple of house moves, jog moves, and I put a bit of weight back on. And then I was like, well, I want to get back to being leaner, and being in a competitive CrossFit space definitely didn't help
Mm.
because I had this image of me needing to be leaner for my performance and my identity and for people to like respect me as a coach. And basically this happened for a few years. I would track, get lean, I would stop tracking, I'd not be as lean anymore, or I would go through fasting and I would do mini fasting cuts where I would get leaner and then get bigger again. And this just kept happening. And I was like, what is going on here? And
Mm.
as I said to you, it was the same thing with clients where I might help clients lose weight and then they might plateau and then start to put weight back on and then they would leave. and I'm thinking, what's going on here? You know, like, why aren't these people getting this sustainable weight loss result? And why aren't I getting that sustainable weight loss result? Is it? So then I started experimenting with more habit-based methods, but still being about weight loss. So it's okay, don't worry about tracking, but let's use habits. And then it was not until I did another certification in nutrition, which was focused much more on holistic health, where they introduced the concept of disordered eating. And it was the first time I'd heard comments like body dysmorphia, disordered eating, and even the term bulimia when used for excessive exercise.
Yeah.
And it was just like the amount of warning signs that went on in my head was like, this was you. You were exercising excessively to stay lean, but you used performance as a scapegoat. You were tracking your calories. You had all of these different rules around food. You were using external methods all the time. You never ever trusted your hunger. You would overeat when you didn't have those rules. And your purging was your exercise, which you would feel guilty for if you didn't do. And consistently body checking, never happy. You know, like if I showed you pictures of me at my leanest, you'd be like, you know, I feel like you're probably underweight. And it was, but I still wanted to be lighter because I was focusing on the weight.
It was never good enough.
No, and I would look at pictures and say, I look fat there.
So it sounds like it was a combination of the increased dysregulation from all the different kinds of food restriction, plus the education that you had. You know, and there's something I also want to mention, that you can be in any size body and have an eating disorder. There's something called atypical anorexia. Tess Holliday is a really good example. You know, she's a fat model who has gone public about her own eating disorder. And once again, we see the trolls coming in and saying, you can't have an eating disorder and have that size body. Yes, you can. And the symptoms and the side effects can be just as dangerous as well. And so you can be having all of this pursuit of weight loss ideas and behaviors and be in a big body and have an eating disorder. I think that's an important message to get out. In fact, the thinking in the eating disorder world is that in terms of all the people with eating disorders, atypical anorexia might be among the largest subsets, along with binge eating disorder. You know, and I think what makes things difficult, as you were describing, is when you have an identity behind the behavior, both as I'm the fit one, or if it's your profession, then the idea of switching or changing or modifying can be really threatening, because it can feel like it's threatening to your excuse me, your own idea. And to answer your question that you asked a little bit ago, you know, about where's the messy middle, you know, one of the things I like to look at is, what is the intention behind the behavior? You know, so I've had patients ask me things like, oh my God, is it okay if I have a salad for dinner? And this is after working with them for quite some time. And so I, instead of just saying what the answer is, well, why the question? What's going on here? You know, and there's a fear that I'm heading back down diet culture. And so my question is, well, why would you want to have a salad to begin with? And usually this happens in the summertime. Oh, it sounds refreshing, or I'm in the mood for the texture of crunchy. Well, the intention behind the behavior is satisfaction, not a problem. So we can look at a behavior, but not know the intention. The intention, I think, helps get clarity of that, you know. And one of the other things I want to mention when you're saying, you know, different sides of the camp in terms of anti-dieters maybe being against exercise. I don't know any anti-dieter activist who's against exercise. What they're against is this idea that's a moral imperative, that if you don't exercise, you're not a good person. And if you don't pursue health, you're not a good person. The idea is you should, just being a human, we should all have dignity and respect and so forth. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way. It's a great way of putting it, and also a great way to draw that line of the intention behind the decision. And funnily enough, not to take words from your mouth, it's something I mentioned quite recently in a different podcast with someone, was the intention behind the decision matters more
than
the decision itself.
Yeah, but we have to look
So
at the impact too, because sometimes
yeah,
I've now see I'm making it more nuanced now, and that is I've
no, good.
had patients over the years like, well, my intention was to be healthy. That's why I was cutting out all these foods, and but the
Yeah, yeah.
impact is, oh, I'm in the rabbit hole. So even though
Mhm.
I gave you an answer, now I'm saying, but here's some exceptions here too, So it's very
Yeah,
nuanced, and I'm not trying to be difficult or make it confusing. I just want to make sure that people aren't getting into harm's way, with some of the
yeah.
rationalizations that might happen that, might keep an eating disorder going longer than it needs to, longer period. Yeah.
It was a good point, yeah, because as you said, it's like the intention behind the decision while using these principles. Because as you mentioned there, we make peace with food and we remove the fear mongering and we return to trusting our bodies. We know that we don't need to remove food groups in order to promote health.
Yeah.
And so it's like the intention behind the decision while working alongside these frameworks and these pillars that you both created, adapted, improved upon, and now have 30 years of research on, which is fantastic.
Yeah. And one of the
So,
things, oh, go ahead, go ahead.
oh no, no, go on.
One of the things I want to emphasize too is that everyone's journey is different in terms of how long it's going to
Mm,
take you to work through this. I've had some people that are very impatient, in part because like they're finally, I'm so sick of diet culture, I can't do this any. I just tell me exactly what to do to be an intuitive eater, which is kind of ironic because they're asking me to do a diet culture kind of thing. And so
Give me the
I'll
plan.
reframe
Give
that
me the plan to follow to be the
exactly, and I'll
intuitive
say,
eater. Yeah,
I'll hear what you want behind that. You want out of suffering sooner rather than later. I can help
yeah,
you. I can. I often will say I'm a tour guide. I can show you all these amazing things you can do to help self connect with your body and your mind, but I can't tell you exactly what to do. And if it takes you
yeah,
2 years or 5 years, it doesn't mean you're a failed intuitive eater. The more complex your history, the more complex the healing is. And there's nothing wrong about that. And so it can be a slippery slope if you start comparing yourself to somebody else on this journey. Everyone's story is different, and there are things about people's backgrounds that you probably have no idea of, in terms of childhood trauma and these kinds of things that can make it complicated. But it's doable. It's very workable. That's the ultimate message here.
yeah. And I think that's the importance then of having a guide, isn't it, to help coach you through it, is to have that reassurance and that hand to hold along the journey because it's a dieter's. It's like the diet need to have the plan to follow. I need to be
Yeah,
doing it right. I'm doing it
yeah,
wrong. Like, oh,
yeah.
I've ditched diets, but now I feel out of control. And so I need to know that I'm doing it right. I can't be having these foods all the time. And you're like, let's just stop
Yeah.
with the
Or sometimes we
shoulds and the oughts and the not, all these
Yeah, sometimes
things.
we need little baby steps or little scaffolding to the principles. Like
Yeah.
I've had people coming in, it's like, I just can't just start from, just even aiming for satisfaction. And so we might
Mm,
say, well, how about if you were to check in with your hunger a few times during the day? What would that be like for you? What would
mm,
it be like to actually not check in, but to honor that hunger in a timely manner to the degree that that is possible? So there's all these little mini steps and baby steps and scaffolding that we can do along the way in service of, like, what do you do if you have no appetite, you're really stressed out? And one of the survival mechanisms is during stress, if you're fighting if you're fighting the enemy or fleeing the enemy, it is very inconvenient to be digesting food, and you're not. Your blood flow goes from your digestive tract to your extremities to get the hell out of the dangerous situation, so you really don't feel
mm.
hunger. Now some people cope with stress by eating, but it's not out of hunger, it's out of coping. So what do you do when hunger is shut off? Oh, well, we need to do nourishment as self-care. That's an important part of this work as well. And so looking at self-care in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and
Yeah,
I love that. Well, Evelyn, I'm conscious of your time. I appreciate you taking it, time out of your day to come on to the podcast. Obviously,
absolutely.
there's the book, and you have a more recent book, don't you? Like the kind of daily prompts for
Oh yeah,
intuitive
I do.
eating.
I have 306. Oh no, I'm sorry. It's intuitive eating for every day. And so yeah, there's a
Yeah,
prompt for every day. That was a labor of love. I love that book. And also for health professionals, I do. We do certification for intuitive
yes,
eating. It's a whole training thing, and you can check that out on the website if you're interested.
brilliant. Well, I'll link those up into the show
Thank
notes as
you.
well, so people can check that out. So,
Awesome.
yeah, thanks again for coming on. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Very good. I did too. Take care.